Good morning. This is the YouTube channel of the study. Myself Aman Jha, and we are continuing with the NCERT concept series. Till now, we have studied up to chapter 4 of class 7 history NCERT, and now we are going to carry forward. So let's start. See, let's go over the contents of the book. First, tracing changes through 1,000 years. If you recall, we are looking into the sources. What are our sources to study the history, and what are the major trends that keep coming or recurring throughout the history of this period? Okay, these two things we looked into. Then in the second chapter, we looked into two important events of early medieval India: the triangular or tripartite struggle for the control of Kannauj, and then in deep south, we look into the Chola Empire. Here we look into the Delhi Sultans, their rise and fall, their various administrative and political and economic measures. Okay, and same we look into the Mughal Empire. And now we are going to focus on specific themes, like in the chapter 5 we are going to look into rulers and buildings, the relationship between rulers and buildings. We are not per se studying buildings, we are not per se studying the architecture, but we will specifically focus on architecture in 12th class. But here we are trying to understand why rulers build the buildings. So see, rulers and buildings, studying architecture is not the theme of the chapter. Okay, we are trying to understand why rulers built anything. So therefore we will look into the messages behind each and every kind of architecture. Okay, not the content or the style behind architecture. We will look into style to a very superficial degree only. So the first, it says that mainly stone architectures have survived, because the wooden architecture, not more than earliest wooden architecture right now we have belongs to the 18th century, not before that, for obvious reasons, for the decomposition of wood. And it makes a point that what is the impact of such architectures on common people, that we will see later. Then it talks about two kinds of engineering skills and constructions. The earlier ones, the arcuate style, sorry, not arcuate, this is the new one, and the Trabeat styles, or the corbelled, the word is used. It talks about two styles and how they are deployed in construction work. And then it classifies buildings into two categories. One for public activities, temples, mosques and tanks, and then goes to the question that why temples were targeted. And then another sort of buildings, gardens, tombs and forts. These were for ruling class. Okay, and then it talks about how between, if you recall, in the first chapter we had talked about regions and empires. We had said that how regional culture, distinct regional cultures had evolved up to this period, and it was in a way hindering the development of empires. Okay, one aspect of a distinct regional identity is a distinct regional architectural style, or at least certain elements. So what it says, that when the empires were created, architectural elements or ideas from one part of the empire were adopted into another part of the empire, and here we will see some examples of that. So let's start the chapter. The first, here obviously you can see, what is it? This is Qutub Minar, the Mehrauli archaeological complex. Those of you who stay in Delhi, or those who happen to visit Delhi, you should go to this place. Very accessible in South Delhi. The impact of such buildings on observers. It says, look, in the medieval period, often the buildings were made of wood, especially the mansions and havelis, such places. They were mostly made of wood. Obviously, because stone is very difficult to work with, still Sultan decides to develop it. Just to give a brief overview, the first floor of the Qutub Minar was built by Qutbuddin Aibak, and rest of the floors were built by his slave and later son-in-law Iltutmish, who was the first Sultan of Delhi. and later on many sultans renovated it, repaired it, etc. Alauddin Khilji tried to build another Qutub Minar. It was called Alai something, and but what happened that Alai Minar it was called. But what happened was that he died, so the funding stopped to the project, and therefore it, though there are some remains of that still around. When you go to the archaeological complex, you will see that right across Qutub Minar there is this huge unfinished work. So many of the sultans also contributed to it. In a way, it's one of the icons of Delhi Sultanate. Here you can see that this is the balcony of first floor, if it is visible. This is the balcony of, now people cannot go inside, but this is the balcony of the first floor. Below the balcony you have two layers of these small arches, and then there you have geometrical designs, and here you have two bands of inscribed they are written in Arabic, and they are inscribed things. This style is called arabesque. If you recall that there are two scripts to write Arabic and Persian, Nastaliq and Shikaste, they have inscribed it in two panels. Now what it says that the minar is tapering, okay, meaning losing width as it goes up. Second, the surface is uneven. Look, the surface keeps changing. There is this angular shape, there is this circular shape. So it says inscribing something on such surfaces. Either you want to make geometrical designs, floral designs, or you want to inscribe some things from scriptures. They say it's a very difficult thing to do. Yet sultans chose to do it. Why? Especially in an era where wooden architecture was the predominant mode of building something. Why would you build something in stone, that too so difficult? What would be the impact? I mean, what is the impact of Burj Khalifa on us these days? What is the impact of Antila building on us these days? What is the impact of Gateway of India? Right? Something very similar must have been in the mind of kings and sultans when they built such things. So this is the idea. This chapter is not about architecture. This chapter is about why rulers built a certain kind of architecture, what was their purpose, what was their message. This is the chapter is about. Okay. The question is the impact of such building on observers. When someone see, either near or far, someone who lived in Delhi or nearby area, or someone who came from far, when they looked at it, I mean, there is this saying in Samarkand, Timur, who was very famous from the 15th century in the Islamic world, in the larger Islamic world or larger Persianate world, for his achievements and glories. There is this inscription of his at one of his buildings in Samarkand. He says, if you challenge us, look at our buildings. Okay, that sums up how a ruler saw his buildings, how a ruler saw his constructions. Okay. Then it says during the medieval period, kings and their officers built two kinds of structures. The first were forts, palaces, gardens, residences, and tombs. Safe, protected, and grandiose place for rest in this world and the next. Even in the next. See, these are the places where they lived. Okay. Forts, palaces, gardens. And also for the next world. Look, now today it might seem that why you want to build something for residence in the next world. But then same pyramid has the same logic, right? People, especially in the pre-modern world, genuinely believed in afterlife. Okay? It is only with the enlightenment, rationality and modernity that these ideas are being seriously challenged and being questioned by a large number of people. But in ancient times, in medieval times, people genuinely believed that when they die in this world, they will go to another world. Now you may call it heaven. You may say that no, there will be a rebirth. Whatever you may call it, that depends on your religious belief. But whatever belief people held, those beliefs were sincere. Being right or wrong is different thing. You need knowledge to be right or wrong. But the faith was sincere. So if a sultan is building something grand, so the faith is certainly there. A sincere faith is certainly there that yes, this would be my resting place in the next world. Okay. And often they would want to be buried next to their kin. But there will be, I would say, grave complexes or tomb complexes where one sultan will be buried next to the another. In Humayun, in the Humayun's Maqbara, in that compound or in that building, the main building where Humayun's Maqbara is, many other Mughal prince and princesses are buried. Dara Shikoh is believed to be buried somewhere there as well. So this is, I mean, you cannot summarily dismiss the fact that, oh, why they would want to build something for the next life. The belief was sincere. That's my point. The second were structures meant for public activity. Means gaining public support, pleasing people. That look, I am not spending everything on myself. I genuinely am concerned about you. I want to look after you, including temples, mosques, tanks, wells, caravansarai and bazaars. Kings were expected to care for their subjects, and by making structures for their use, rulers hoped to win their praise. However, domestic architecture like Havelis have survived only from the 18th century. This was a separate point. That these are, that because they will be made from wood and wood decomposes. So if you go to the old city areas in say Delhi or in any other city, you will see Havelis that are a few centuries old. But that's about it. They cannot go as far as Qutub Minar, which is now almost 800 years old. I mean, if you look at the beginning from Qutbuddin Aibak, so certainly that old wooden architecture would not survive. Okay, so and unfortunately they are the most prominent. Whenever they were built, they were the most prominent, but they don't survive. It's something very similar to the Stone Age. We used to say that definitely even during Stone Age, people would have used more wooden tools than stone tools, but they don't survive. So we are entirely dependent on stone tools. Similarly here as well. Now it talks about, first before we go into architecture, we want to talk about two main types of engineering skills. A, called Trabiyat or Corbel style. What it says of architecture, placing wooden beams or a slab of stone across four walls. But the task becomes difficult if we want to make a large room with an elaborate superstructure. I mean, normally when we are constructing our house, what we do, that first walls are erected, okay, then lintel is put on it. What do you put? Some wooden pillars, put planks on top of it, and then you fill it with typical construction material, and that is how roof is built. So put it simply, you have two walls and you created roof on it. That's it. This is called beam and lintel style. Many people call linter. Linter is not correct. Lintel. Okay, this is the beam and lintel style. Very simple. Just put a slab on top of the two beams. This is very visible in the case of doors. And in fact, even roof is built in this manner. Now, if it's a small room, you don't need pillar in between. But if it's a large room, then you will need pillars to hold on to that roof. Okay. So what happens when you have a very large room? You will certainly have large number of pillars. So that disturbs the view. Okay. You cannot look around without getting without pillars coming in your way. So this is one problem with beam and lintel style, that a large room will need lots of pillars, and that hinders your view. Okay, because there are lots of blind spots that you cannot see. That's one problem of that. Between 8th and 13th centuries, the Trabiyat style, okay, was used in the construction of temples, mosques, tombs, and in buildings attached to large step wells called bawlis. Now, ideally they would have preferred to use what you called arch and dome. But if you recall the early Sultanate architecture, since they lacked the artisans they deployed, which were local artisans, they lacked the skills to build, true arch and true dome. So they also depended the style of architecture called Tabiyat or Corbel to build their early mosque. But later on, they brought artisans from Central Asia, West Asia. They trained the local artisans, so then they could build true arch and true dome. And here they have given two examples of Kandaria Mahadev temple and Rajeshwara. But before that, let's look briefly at the evolution of temple architecture. In the post-Mauryan period, the Buddha and Bodhisattva began to be worshipped in idol form. Okay, in Mahayana school of Buddhism. There are two, Mahayana and Hinayan, two major sects, and in Mahayana, Buddha was worshipped in idol form. Not only Buddha but Bodhisattva as well. At the same time, it is believed that due to bhakti, the practice of worshipping gods in a form of statue or idol became popular in Hinduism also. Okay. Then you had this Gandhara school, Mathura school and Amravati school of architecture out of this. On one hand, this practice of idol worship emerged. On another hand, the stories of Puranas that must have been told orally for many generations and eventually, and orally told, transmitted over a wide area, then eventually written down. So those stories pertain to the lives and incarnations and magic and such things of gods. You must have seen some television shows based on certain Puran in which a god takes a particular incarnation to deal with a particular problem on earth, more or less dealing with certain demons that have overpowered gods and how they are destroying the social order, moral order. So God comes in a certain forms, takes care of the problem and then goes back. So such themes are repeated again and again in such shows. So there are stories. So on one hand you have the stories of Puranas, on another hand you have idol worship, and these two combine together in bhakti and temple cult. For example, you will often see that a theme from just as Jatak story were sculpted on the railings of stup, similarly the stories from Puranas or themes were sculpted on the walls of temples. There is this Shesh Shayan Vishnu on you have in Lalitpur, you have this very ancient temple which belongs to the Gupta period, and there on its outer wall you have Shesh Shayan Vishnu, which is a theme from Puran. So similarly, just as Jatak stories were sculpted on stupas, similarly Purana stories or themes were sculpted on you will say temple walls. You will have Ganga and Yamuna standing as doorkeepers. Okay, you will have doorkeepers of Garbhagriha. Then similarly you have Vahan of a certain particular god, the mount, that it would be a bull or tiger or some. If you have a local deity, then you will have some local animal. So such themes, they are picked, they were incorporated into temple architecture, and early temples began to be constructed. Now, a demarcated area deemed sacred due to its association with relics of pious person, divinity, deities, natural elements, religious beliefs, etc. This is the definition of shrines. So it may be possible that earlier temples were not temples actually, meaning that earlier you only had shrine, that you want to worship a particular god, say a bargad, a banyan tree, or you want to worship some other element, say you want to worship a ghost, or you want to worship an animal, say snake. See, fertility cult is very old in India. So, or you wanted to worship certain forest god. Okay, so then you may not have temples, you just go to a sacred place, okay, and then you worship the god there. But gradually the Puranic gods became more important, there were stories about them, and then another element of idol worship and temple cult came up. So early, this is how religion may have transformed into modern Hinduism. The Gupta period stone and brick temples are the oldest extant ones. Devghar, Iran, it's in Lalitpur district of UP. Okay, this is in MP, Madhya Pradesh. Here Nachna Kuthar, it's also this is in MP, Panna district. You have Udaygiri, it's near Vidisha. Here you have both cave temples mainly. Okay. These are the earliest stone and brick temples that survive. And then many other features were added to these temples. Jagati means the platform on which a raised platform on which the temple is built. Okay. Then earliest temples only had a flat roof. Then gradually they built a larger and larger superstructures. They are called Shikhara in Nagara school of architecture and Viman in Dravida school of architecture. Then they thought that let's put a circumambulation pathway around the sanctum sanctorum, the Garbhagriha. So earlier they may have been open, then they started to covering that one as well. Mandap, the pavilion in front of Garbhagriha where devotees can stand, sing prayers, perform rituals, etc. Vahan, which is the mount of a god. So normally it is right in front of Pradakshina Path, but in certain temples it is outside the mandap between the Gopuram and temple. And then sculptures on outer walls, inner walls, doors. So these sculptures are based on themes from Puranas and etc. Okay. Say and then you have this Panchayatan style where main shrine is here and then you will have 4 subsidiary shrines. Okay. Or the main shrine could be in the middle and the subsidiary shrines are on 4 sides. In this case, main shrine will be here and subsidiary shrines are on 4 sides. So I am not saying that these elements were added one by one or in that order. It is possible that in certain areas they first added Pradakshina Path and then they added Shikhar, or they may have added platform in the last. I am saying these elements were gradually incorporated into the temple architecture, and up to early medieval period, grand built temples. Early medieval period they started building grand temples. But throughout this period, the corbelled or Trabiyat style of lintel and beam, that you want to build a room, you put roof over it. Now if the room is small, you don't need pillars, but if the room is large, okay, or the pavilion is large, then you will need pillars. This is the main essence, that this Trabiyat or corbelled style right from the beginning of temple architecture up to the very end continued. Then there was another variety of cave temples, monolithic and structural temples. The earliest temples, say Udaygiri temples, it's one of the cave temple. You have in Badami, you have cave temples. Then you had monolithic stone temples, meaning they are constructed out of one single stone. That stone may be available locally or brought somewhere from outside. The temples of Mahabalipuram are examples of such monolithic temples. And then you have structural temples, the much larger ones, where individual pieces of rocks are constructed using mortar, etc. Up to the early medieval period, you had 3 full-fledged styles: Nagara school of architecture, Dravida school of architecture, and Vesara school of architecture. And even within them you had variations. For example, in Nagara school you have Gujarat school or Rajput school, you have Odisha school, you have Kangra school, okay, you have Khajuraho and Central India school. So there were regional variations in each of them as also. Point being here that the Trabiyat or corbelled style continued throughout the period, and now we are going to look into the one main example. Look, this is the Kandaria Mahadev temple in Khajuraho. Now it is believed that it was a royal temple, means the common people were prohibited from entering. And look at the structure. You have this raised platform, Jagati, okay. Now obviously we will understand the largest shikhar will be on top of the Garbhagriha, where the statue of the god is consecrated. Then you have a malak and you have kalash at the top of it. And these are subsidiary shikhar, since the Garbhagriha and the Pradakshina Path around it is so large that you have to cover it entirely. So having only one shikhar will give it very empty look. So you have subsidiary shikhars as well. And also if there are subsidiary shrines of Panchayatan style, then you have to put smaller shikhar on top of that as well. Then here you have this mandap part, but now it has become so huge that this is the mandap, this is the mukh mandap, and this is the ardha mandap, okay. And from here we cannot see, but there will certainly be a Pradakshina Path around the Garbhagriha, and then the 4 subsidiary shrines on the both sides, and from here you can access the place. In later Vijayanagar period, another feature was added called Kalyan Mandap. Now in Kalyan Mandap, they will have royal ceremonies, royal weddings, the wedding ceremonies of gods and goddesses, such things. So this is how this temple architecture has evolved. But the main feature, the Trabiyat or Corbel style of putting roof over it, has continued. Okay, without it, it would not work. And even early Islamic architecture, what we saw, we talked about mosque, that since they lacked artists, they did not have artisans trained in building a true arch and dome, they used the artisans that were locally available, and they understood local style. So even their early mosque and architecture were built in Trabiyat and Corbel style. This is the main frame, or the frame in front of the Quwwatul Islam mosque. Okay, it was built by using the demolished material from a Jain temples nearby, and at the back of it you can see these pillars. Okay, you can see the roof here as well. So they put up a frame in front of it, but this frame, this is not a true arch. Okay, we will see what a true arch is. They just simply gave an impression of arch, but essentially this is a lintel and beam style. Okay, here you have two pillars. Okay, here you have, two main walls, and on top of it you have built this. You just only carved it out to give it a shape of arch. This is a true arch. Why? Because it has a keystone. Point is, if you remove this keystone, then the entire arch will collapse. This is how you can identify a true arch. That the keystone is very important. You must have heard in biology and ecology the concept of keystone species. That for any particular ecological system, there may be one or more than one keystone species that are holding that entire ecosystem. And if they are removed, or if their numbers go down drastically, then the ecological functions will become imbalanced. And that is the reason why we are so concerned with the conservation of keystone species like tigers and lions, etc. Because they hold the entire system together. Okay, they control the population of primary the population of the species in the food chain below them. Otherwise, what happens, that those species that feed on grass and vegetation, those that feed on autotrophs, they will consume them, and then imbalance will the entire system will be imbalanced. So that concept comes from this. Two innovations of Islamic architecture: arcuate. Weight of the superstructure above the doors and windows was carried by arches. The weight is being carried by arch, and even in arch they are in such a way stacked that keystone is the most important stone. And mortar, and how these individual pieces, these you can see the borders of these pieces, how these pieces are together with the help of a mortar that uses limestone. Okay, limestone cement, when mixed with stone chips, hardened into concrete. This made the construction of large structures easier and faster. Now, if you have a structure built with arch, okay, and when that if you have arch, you can have dome on top of it. Then you will not need pillars inside the room, no matter how large the room is. And if you are if you are putting pillars, that is because you are using it as an ornamentation tool, not because it requires the structure doesn't require it. You are using it as a sort of ornamentation. Building temples, mosques and tanks, apart from being places of worship, it meant to demonstrate power, wealth and devotion of the patron. For obvious reasons, in a way, it became a symbol of sovereignty. Think about how you associate USA with Statue of Liberty. Think about how you associate India with Taj Mahal. Okay, think about how you associate the wall of China with China, of course. So this is how a particular, an architectural feature which is so grand that it becomes an identity. Okay, it becomes a symbol of power of the country. I mean, Taj Mahal is a symbol of India's soft power. Okay. Other things like through the rituals of worship in the temple, Raj Dev, he was a Chola king. honored god Rajarajeshwaram, a form of Shiv. Now the names are so similar. Okay, this actually this temple was in Thanjavur, and the temple is look, there are actually two Brihadeshwara temple. One, this one, the temple dedicated to Rajarajeshwar, and another Brihadeshwara temple that his son Rajarajadev's son Rajendra first constructed in his new capital called Gangai Konda Cholpuram. Now they may not have used the term Brihadeshwar here so that they don't confuse between the two, but both in the Thanjavur is also called Brihadeshwar and Gangai Konda Cholpuram one also called Brihadeshwar. Look how the name of the king and the god he is worshipping appear, rather rhyming. It is indirectly that the king is comparing himself with the god, and in fact it was a practice among Chola kings to put their statue in temples, not in Garbhagriha but in other places. The king and his Samantas worshipped the chief deity and lesser gods and goddesses together. Earlier we talked about the Panchayatan style, right, in which there is one main shrine. Okay, you will have one main shrine here, and there will be 4 subsidiary shrines. Now they could be entirely in front of it, or you may have main shrine here and 4 subsidiary here. That will depend upon the overall structure. So if king is worshipping this god on certain occasions, and his Samant or his Mahasamants are worshipping these gods, what they are doing? They are creating a replication of the political order that exists on the earth. They are creating a reflection of that political order in pantheon, the religious pantheon as well. They are saying, look, just as Shiv is the supreme god and then he has subsidiary gods, his children, or the other gods. Similarly, the king, am the supreme and these Samantas are my junior. So this in a way reflects the prevailing feudal structure of society and polity, in the religious architecture also. And this practice is actually very old. We have good evidence, we have on good authority to say that the practice of putting statues in temples goes as far as Kushans. It is believed that the headless life-size statue of Kushan, that Kanishk, that has been found from Mathura, may have belonged to a nearby shrine where the Kushana kings and other gods were worshipped. So we have on very good authority, we have solid archaeological evidence to suggest that even Kushan kings used to put their statues in temples. So it's not like that it was an early medieval innovation. An inscription in the Quwwatul-Islam mosque explained that God chose Alauddin as a king because he had the qualities of Moses and Solomon. These are very ancient heroes of Abrahamic world. We don't need to go into details who was Moses and Solomon, but they were very glorified figures of Abrahamic world. The great lawgivers of past. So, though Muslim sultans are not comparing themselves with God, but they are saying that I am the shadow of the God. Okay, especially in the Persian Tariq writing. Okay, often the sultan is called the shadow of God on earth. So they have a slight different way, but the message is same, that God has chosen me. See, now what happens? Nowadays, God doesn't choose anyone. Political campaigners, candidates come to us during campaigning. They make promises, true or false, and then on the basis of that, their credibility, their identity, be it religious or caste, whatever, there are different sorts of considerations and not all of them are pleasant. But eventually, it is the people who decide that who is most worthy. Now, kings and sultans, they cannot ask people to choose. So what they say, look, that I am the favorite of God. Okay, the God has chosen me. I have certain attributes that you common people certainly don't have, don't even imagine you will ever have. In fact, other nobles and other dynasties also don't have it. I am the only one who was chosen by God. And there is this story about Nizamuddin Aulia Muhammad bin Tughlaq. They have not given this example in the book, but I recalled it, so I thought we may discuss it in the class. The Zafar Khan was the person who established Bahmani Sultanate. Okay, he revolted against Muhammad bin Tughlaq and established Bahmani Sultanate. Now, Bahmani Sultanate was established much later after the death of Nizamuddin Aulia. But see how the idea of legitimacy works. There was this very popular saying in 14th and 15th century Dakkan that once Zafar Khan went to visit Nizamuddin Aulia, so just Muhammad bin Tughlaq was just coming out of his room. So Nizamuddin Aulia says that while one sultan is departing from my place, another is coming. And at that time, Zafar Khan was simply a military commander, an important military commander, but had no political ambitions. So they said that, look, the great venerated, Nizamuddin Aulia had predicted that Zafar Khan will establish a sultanate one day. So this tells you, rather in an indirect way, that how kings and sultans tried to justify their political actions that were based on their ambition, but then they eventually had to justify that, look, gods or the saints, somebody blessed me, somebody put his hand over my head. Okay. Other sultans, often sultans would get their tomb built next to the tomb of a Sufi saint who could mediate on their behalf in the next world. Just as they wanted to build elaborate tombs for themselves so that they can rest in the next life, often sultans build their tombs next to Sufi saints. They thought, okay, if I live next to Sufi, this particular saint, then that he may mediate on my behalf with gods, that this person should be allowed in heaven, such stuff. See, now today these things might appear incredible, as in not credible, but for a pre-modern mind, I am trying to emphasize here that what is important, that belief should be sincere. Being accurate, being right or wrong are separate issues. Okay, that only a modern mind can judge. So this was also a way how they practice this thing. They, in many places, you would have a composite archaeological complex where you will have a dynastic mausoleum where one after the other sultans are buried. Often they will have a tomb of a venerated Sufi saint very nearby to them. Now, why seek popular acceptance at all? You are not fighting elections. Then why you need acceptance from people? Why are you building mosques and tanks and temples to ponds, such things? Why you want people's acceptance or approval? That though you are not fighting elections, still you have to be popular. No person, no matter how old the concept of kingship is, no matter how centralized the power is, you have to understand that you need popular approval, at least of the people who live in cities around you. I mean, Razia Sultan was so popular among the people of Delhi that the nobles that were conspiring against her knew that we cannot assassinate her in the city, else we would not survive. So what to do? They thought, let's hatch up a plan and rather trick her into coming out of city. So she went on a military campaign and there she was ambushed and killed. First imprisoned and then killed later. So even though you don't go to ask for votes in regular elections, still you have to be approved by people. You cannot, if you recall in last lecture, in last to last lecture, when we were talking about Delhi Sultanate, we said that how the Tariq writers say that the state cannot flourish without flourishing farmers, and that will not happen without a just rule. So even in a pre-democratic societies where power was very centralized, okay, very aristocratic, still you need people's approval, certainly not as much as you need now. As each new dynasty came to power, kings wanted to emphasize their moral right to rule. For example, these origin myths. We saw the origin myths of Gurjar Pratihar, we saw the origin myth of, Suryavanshi, Chandravanshi. In a way to say, Balban, who was a Delhi Sultanate king, he connected himself to a very ancient Persian king, Afrasiab, that I am his descendant. Okay, so these things are very common, that you need origin myth to justify your rule. You say that I was chosen by God, or I am on equal pedestal to the God. constructing shrines helped rulers to proclaim their close relationship with God. So in a way, you are showing to the people that you have fealty to the gods and saints that look after the people and kingdom. Rulers also offered patronage to learned and pious and tried to transform their capitals and cities into great cultural centers that brought fame to their rule and their realm. And often, therefore, you will see many of the sultans will construct madrasas, okay, so that they will ensure that people from near and far will come for religious education to their kingdom, and that will also enhance their popularity. The ideas like Navratna, 9 jewel, even Chandragupta Vikramaditya had Navratna, Akbar had Navratna. Many of the kings patronized, scholars that wrote accounts about their kingship, or they wrote, good literary work. The Persian Renaissance that started in the court of Mahmud of Ghazni. So that's a very common practice. Making water available by constructing tanks and reservoirs was highly praised. Sultan Iltutmish won universal respect for constructing a large reservoir because just outside Delhi Kuna, reservoir just outside Delhi Kuna, it was called the Hauz-e-Sultani. Look, it's a rather strange way of, a rather strange concept of governance. That if elements of nature did not function properly, if there were not regular rains, if there were recurring famines, if there were epidemics, then somehow people will start turning against Sultan. Now a Sultan that you have not elected, but you think that, okay, since heavens and gods are so against us, we must have done something wrong. We must have allowed a wrong person to rule over us. So if the truth is, hard living conditions made people, angry, and then you need a ventilation of that anger. So, but how people used to think, okay, the heavens must be angry on us that this person who is not, capable, or who is not pious enough to rule is ruling. So in this way, the medieval kings and sultans felt threatened. Okay. Therefore, constructing tanks was important. That, okay, if there is water scarcity, we will have tanks and people can use it. So in a way to calm them down. And why were temples targeted? We saw that it meant to demonstrate the power, wealth, and devotion of the patron. Therefore, they were targeted. Apart from being places of worship, they meant to demonstrate power, wealth, and devotion of the patron. When the kings attacked each other, they often targeted these buildings. And then they have given three sorts of example. An example from early 19th century, a Pandyan king, Srimara Srivallabha, attacked Sri Lankan king Sena I. His capital was Madurai. Now a Buddhist source tells us that when he attacked Sri Lanka, by the time Sri Lanka was fully Buddhist, he looted a lot of Buddha statues. A statue of Buddha which was entirely made out of gold. He took them from the royal palace and took the lot of wealth and statues from monasteries. So when the next Sri Lankan king, Sena II, eventually he had to take revenge, avenge the humiliation. So he asked his generals, who then attacked Madurai, to specifically look for those statues that he had stolen. Similarly, the Shiv temple of Rajendra I. Here we had talked about Rajendra Dev. He was the father, and Rajendra Rajaraja Dev. Okay, Rajaraja the first he is also called, and Rajendra first he was the son of him. A sun pedestal from the Chalukyas, a Ganesh statue, and several statues of Durga, a Nandi statue from Eastern Chalukyas, an image of Bhairav, a form of Shiva, and Bhairavi from Kalinga of Odisha, and a Kali statue from Pala empires. If you recall, we had said that Rajendra I used the same path that to attack the Pala dynasty and the northern India, which was used by Samudragupta to go south. When he came back, he brought the water of Ganga in very large number of pots. He constructed a new city called Gangaikonda Cholpuram, meaning the person who has conquered Ganga, and he used all the Ganga water to fill the pond that he dug up in front of this Shiva temple, which was also called Brihadeshwara temple. So that also shows that practice of taking, or rather desecrating the temples of an enemy king, stealing the statues, it was common thing. They are giving these examples, and then at last they give the example of Sultan Mahmud. He was not a very important ruler at that time. This is the important point, not a very important ruler at that time. But by destroying temples, especially the ones at Somnath, he tried to win credit as a great hero of Islam. I mean, historians have proven that his image as a great figure was created by the later historians. The historians of his time did not take much note of him. Okay. Also, the information about his temple raids are primarily available from his own sources. The other, especially the local sources, don't mention him. And he had many competitors. He himself had, defected from a Samanid Sultanate of Central Asia and Persia. Then he was competing with Seljuk Turks. He was competing with Khwarizmis. He was fighting the non-Muslim heathen tribes of Central Asia. So he was not such big shot, but he intentionally targeted the temples, so that he could, steal and grab as much wealth as possible, so that he could use them in his, empire building activity in Central Asia. And second, he could gain legitimacy in the eyes of other Muslims. He tried to win credit as a great hero of Islam. But this image of a great hero of Islam, okay. For example, I'll give you one example of this person. Recently, a book came out about Suhail Dev. Okay. Now he fights this person called Salar Masood Ghazi, if I'm getting the name correct. Now the story is that he came to India with Mahmud Ghazni. Okay. But the contemporary sources don't mention him. Even the sources of Mahmud Ghazni don't mention him. He is mentioned by later historians, and the story and the myth and the legend around Salar Masood Ghazi, that came up later. Even the contemporary sources, even the sources of Mahmud Ghazni, they don't mention him. So what happens is that often your image is built up much later. He was a much smaller man and he was made a much bigger man by later historians. The other sorts of things, gardens, tombs and forts that they built only for themselves. Okay. In his autobiography, Babur described, so this was in a way not entirely private, but let's say these were for royal usage. Okay. Now you might say, look, people live inside forts, but then the main purpose of fort is to defend the capital. Okay. To defend the political power. And whenever a siege happens, they shut down the gates of the forts, and then those people who are inside, they cannot go outside, and those who are outside cannot come inside, even when they are the subject of the king. So primarily the purpose of fort is, the royal power, to protect the royal power as a symbol of royal power, not the residence of common people. In his autobiography, Babur described his interest in planning and laying out formal gardens within rectangular walled enclosures and divided into 4 quarters by artificial channels. You can simply say, you can have this, okay, and then by artificial channels, you can divide it into 4 parts. So this is your char bagh style, the earliest form, rather crude manner of it. You have a walled garden and then you divide it into 4 parts with artificial channels. It's called char bagh style, any 4 gardens. Beginning with Akbar, some of the most beautiful char baghs were constructed by Jahangir, Shah Jahan in Kashmir, Agra and Delhi. For example, in Delhi, you have Humayun's tomb, which is in char bagh style. Look, this is Humayun's tomb, it's in center, and you can see it's in char bagh form. And in fact, even each part is divided, further subdivided. Say, earlier ones were simple char baghs, okay, 4 parts. But gradually they developed, and each part was also divided into 4 parts. So you have almost 16 parts. And here you have Humayun's tomb. Okay, this is here. this frame like structure, that you have a frame of arches and then you have a pistak in between. It's visible. Say you will have a large pistak in between. This is available in, this is there in Jahangir's tomb also. For inspiration, Akbar's, in Kashmir you have this Shalimar Bagh. They have given the schematic of Shalimar Bagh in book. When you are reading the book, you should look into it. And that Shalimar Bagh is, like step-like formation. You have a Char Bagh, then you have, if you remember the Karewa belt of Kashmir Valley, okay, you have this step-like formation in Shalimar Bagh. And in Agra, the Taj Mahal and many such places are in the Char Bagh style. For inspiration, Akbar's architectures turned to the tombs of his central ancestor Timur. Again, he was very popular. Okay, the use of red sandstone and the use of glazed marble, which are very colorful. These are inspirations from Central Asia. The central towering dome, the double dome, okay, and the tall gateway became important aspects of Mughal architecture. Now, what is a double dome? See, a single dome will not be visible from very long distance. If you recall that when we talked about temples, we said earlier Gopurams were smaller, but as the temples, the settlements around temple became larger and larger, they needed larger enclosure, and each time the Gopuram or the entrance gateway was even larger. So what happened that people could see the temple gateway from very long distance. But the problem with a dome is that if you make it too high, the structural integrity gets compromised. So the smaller dome, and then you have a bigger dome over a smaller dome, which is visible from a very long distance. And there is a misconception that the earliest example of a proper double dome is in Humayun's tomb, though it is very popular and very large, but the experiment with double dome had started during the Lodi Sultanate itself. And Pishtas, this is the tall gateway, okay, this one, Pishtak, became important aspects of Mughal architecture, first visible in Humayun's tomb. The tomb was placed in the center of a huge formal Char Bagh and built in the tradition of known as Paradise, Hushed Beast, a central hall surrounded by 8 rooms. So this hall has 8 rooms on the side, here just below the dome. And look, even domes have an evolution. This dome, look, it has a proper neck and then it suddenly has a point. But whereas dome normally would be like this. So from this to this, it also has a journey. But then those things will be studied when we study architecture separately. Then in 2015, there was this mains question. How does Tuzuke Baburi testify that Babur had been a cultural man? So one example we saw here, that in his autobiography, Babarnama or Tuzuke Baburi, it was translated later into, Persian, but earlier it was written in Chagatai. He's a man of culture. So here we saw that he expresses his interest in Char Bagh style. So even when you haven't studied, now see, there is no way you can study so many sources, so many books. So what happens? You use available examples. If you recall this example, that he says that he was very keen, he had very keen interest in gardening. Also, in first chapter we talked about then when Babur, we were talking about the different meanings and changing scope of the word Hindustan. We said that when a Tariq writer from Delhi Sultanate, Minhajus Siraj, says Hindustan, he only means North India, few provinces of North India. But when Babur talks about the flora and fauna and nature of North India, he uses the word Hindustan in the sense of entire subcontinent. So you can use that example also, that he was not only interested in his own achievements, he also talked about the things he saw around himself. So you can, if it's a 10 marker, you can at least give 2 examples that will at least fetch you average marks. At least. So even when you haven't studied the reference books very closely, even by using 2 examples from NCERT, this question can be answered. Okay. Shah Jahan's audience halls resembled a mosque. Now see, this is going in the direction of Chola kings. Okay. The pedestal on which his throne was placed was frequently described as the Qibla. I mean the direction which Muslims face while offering namaz. Okay. Since everybody faced that direction when court was in session. So now Qibla has a very strong religious meaning. but you are saying the direction in which king's throne is located, that is being called Qibla. So this is what is happening, that from calling yourself a shadow of the God, you went a step further and into the direction of divinity. The idea of the king as a representative of God on earth was suggested by these architectural features, obviously. And his audience halls, I mean Diwan-e-Aam or Diwan-e-Khas, they were built in the fashion called Chihil Shutun, means 40 pillared halls. Now you will say, sir, if you have, earlier we talked about that in Arkoid style you don't need halls, but then this was not in Arkoid style. If you need pillars, then see, up to the Mughal period what happened, that the both indigenous traditions and Islamic traditions were fully fused. Especially there are many examples of this happening in Agra, in Fatehpur Sikri and in Delhi. So up to that point, the clear-cut separation between a structure based on arch and dome and a structure based on pillar and lintel was not there. You will have composite buildings where one part will be built in this manner, another part will be this manner, and then some parts will have both features. Behind the emperor's throne was a series of Petra Dura. Now what is a Petra Dura? Simple. You either have a marble or you have a sandstone. Now marble is a metamorphic rock which is formed out of limestone, and sandstone is obviously sedimentary rock. So now you can have both white marble and black marble. Okay, you will have a marble sedimentary rock, you will create grooves. Okay, the trained artisans will create grooves, and those grooves will be filled with semi-precious stones, colorful semi-precious stones, and that will give a very beautiful presentation. Here, see, this is a proper one marble slab, and they have created grooves, and grooves they have filled these colorful stones. Now they can use glass as well here. So to create a design in stones, that is Petra Dura. It's actually a Byzantine, both in the evolution of dome and in the evolution of Petra Dura. The Byzantine Empire, which was in the modern Turkey area in medieval period, it has played a very important role. It depicted legendary Greek god Orpheus playing the lute. It was believed that Orpheus's music could calm ferocious beasts until they coexisted together. Now, have you seen there is certain popular tea brand, I would not take the name. They show that they two, a goat and a tiger, they are taking tea from the same cup. It's very similar to that, isn't it? They say that that god, his music is so powerful. Now in that tea company's case, they say that our tea is so powerful that it calms ferocious beasts until they coexist together peacefully. The construction of Shah Jahan's audience hall aimed to communicate that the king's justice would treat the high and low as equal, and creating a world where all could live together in harmony. In a way, they are saying that what they are trying to emphasize, that the Basha is as much powerful, if not more powerful than the nature, because nature has asked a ferocious beast to be ferocious. Yet he says that my justice is so, my justice is so grand that I can treat different, people who are differently placed in society, richest among the rich and the poorest among the poor. I can make them live harmoniously. So in such a way, the idea behind this chapter is not to study architecture. The idea behind this chapter is to study the message behind the architecture. Okay. We saw Petra Dura. In a variation of Char Bagh garden, okay, we saw they had the simple Char Bagh that Babur used to construct. He made many Char Bagh gardens, and then you had even, the composite ones where you divide the 4 parts into further parts by using artificial channels. And here you have mostly plant trees and stuff and flowers, etc. In a variation of the Char Bagh garden, the dwelling was not located in the middle but at its edge, close to the bank of the river. If you have a river bank, otherwise it will be at the edge. Say normally the construction will be done here, either a mausoleum or a house. But they said, no, I don't want to construct it here. I want to build it here, especially if a river is flowing close by. You can see the example of Taj Mahal. Look, There is a Charbagh in front of it, but behind is Yamuna. And in Agra, there were many nobles who were building their homes in this fashion. So Shah Jahan thought, yeah, what is this? They are emulating Badshah. We built my Taj Mahal, I have my palace next to the river. They are also building their mansions next to the river. So in a way, they are emulating the Badshah. So in the new city of Shah Jahanabad that he constructed in Delhi, the imperial palace commanded the riverfront. Only specially favored nobles, like his eldest son Dara Shikoh, were given access to the river. All others had to construct their homes in the city away from river Yamuna. You see here, this is where only the imperial household had access to river. Okay, rest, see these greenery. Obviously, they are building their, nobles are building their house, but they are away from river. They were not given access to river. Only few the chosen ones, maybe this and this, they had access. Here, this is the Jama Masjid, which is still around. Lal Killa is still around. You have this main Chandni Chowk, and the rest is, most of things have been, let's say, the time, the time has taken its toll. Sharing of ideas between regions. I would like to recall you that in first chapter we talked about empire and regions. There we said that up to the 7 and 800 CE, regional identities, regional cultural identities had emerged, and they were promoting regional political formations, regional state formations. It's common. I mean, in India we have federal structure, and most of our states are arranged around linguistic provinces, isn't it? So a distinct cultural identity is bound to promote, political ambitions. So in that case, what happens? Today we often have this conflict between, of politicians, especially the state level politicians often point out to the threats to the federal structure. Okay, but every now and then center tries to assert itself. Something similar, but did happened in this time also, that often an ambitious Badshah, Akbar or Aurangzeb or Alauddin Khilji, Muhammad bin Tughlaq or Cholas, what they will do? They will try to build an empire. And when they try to build an empire, they will, no matter how well you treat your enemy, but still you have to make your subsidiary. That person must accept your authority. So there was always this tension between the regional powers and central imperial power. But besides these tensions, there were many instances of cultural interaction, trade and exchange of ideas as well. One such exchange was visible in the case of architecture. Cross-fertilization of styles and forms within an empire. First example is Elephant Stable at Hampi. Let's see here. This is Hampi, the capital of Vijayanagar. Now you see, this appears like the Shikhar or Viman, but this appears like a tomb. You have this frame of arches. This is also from what they are saying, that in the south there was Vijayanagar Empire, but to the north was Bahmani Sultanate, the one we talked about that Zafar Khan established. Okay, so they saying that they were exchanging the ideas of architecture. You have this frame and then you have these tombs. Then you have Govinda Dev temple in Vrindavan. Look, this is a temple and you have these corbels, you have these pillars, they all show. But look at these, lofty arches. At the top you have this arch. Earlier we talked about something called squinch. That squinch is visible in Alai Darwaza. What happened that on the floor you have 4 walls, but at the top, at the corner of these walls, you create additional structures that on the top you can put a tomb. That is one way. This is something similar but slightly different as well. Here you have a stupa structure, okay, and there you see these arches, okay, these things on top of it. What it tells you, it allows you to build a dome over it. Okay, eventually now you can see this much. Here they will have this full structure. From here they will have this full structure, and on top of it they will put a dome. So in a way, 4 arches are rising from 4 sides, and on top of it you can put a dome. This is something like squinch. Another example is in Akbar's capital, the Mughals liked the Bangla dome. What is a Bangla dome? Here, look, it looks like, roof of a hut, isn't it? This curve, and this was popular in Bengal. As you can see, there is a trident, so it was on top of a temple. But this Bangla dome feature was not only adopted in regional mosque, even Mughals adopted it into the architecture of Fatehpur Sikri. So, an element of architecture that was inspired from huts, the local huts in which poor people live. Okay, their roof, this inclined roof looks like a roof of a hut. First it was used in temple, and then it was incorporated in mosque as well. And then from local mosque, it went into the Fatehpur Sikri's architecture. In Akbar's capital at Fatehpur Sikri, many of the buildings show the influence of the architectural styles of Gujarat and Malwa. You will see the house of Birbal, or you will see the house of Jodhabai. There you will clearly see the influence of Jain style of architecture and Rajasthani style of architectures. Here, you see these pillars, there is this chatar, and then you have these architectural, these carvings, and then you have these supporting things. We have decorated pillars and struts holding the extension of the roof. What we have chhajja kind of things in Jodhabai's palace. These follow architectural traditions of the Gujarat design. So what happened that they picked up ideas from one region and took to the next region as well. In Samarkand, this part is not in the book. I thought I should add it here just to give some more examples of how royalty tries to convey a message from through the lens of architecture. Near Samarkand, one of Timur's inscriptions boldly proclaim, "If you challenge our power, look at our buildings." So a building doesn't matter what kind. It could be of public use, it could be of private use. It could be a religious structure, it could be a royal structure. A Timurid style integrated complex at Mandu, it's in MP, commissioned by Mahmud Shah Khalji, nothing to do with the Khalji dynasty. Khalji dynasty of Delhi Sultanate, nothing to do with them. They were just another Khalji. They created the Malwa Sultanate at the death of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. It has a Jama Masjid, a tomb, means a congregational mosque, a tomb, and a madrasa cum dynastic complex. So earlier we had separate things. You will have a mausoleum at one place, you will have mosque at another. They will be totally separate. But here you have an integrated archaeological complex which is directly inspired from Timurid style. Even the Bengal Sultan, in their local mosques, they incorporated the elements of Iraq and such other places. So they in a way skipped entirely they did not take any inspiration from Delhi Sultanate, because they were in a constant competition with Delhi Sultanate. Where they look to? They look directly to the Iraq and other places, and in their mosques they incorporated those elements. So this is how royalty tries to express certain messages through its architecture. So this is the end of lecture 5. In next lecture we will see next chapters. Thank you.